Hey guys, Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com, back for another session of High Power University. We're in the functionality module and we're digging into the slide and the slide components now. And for one final illustration for the internal extractor compared to external extractor model, this is going to give you an idea what FN did essentially when they went from one to the other. Is they traded off two parts that are very complex to make, and a channel through the slide, and then this machining in this part of the slide, and the need to make this part, make it match the slide serrations here. They traded off those two parts and traded off that channel that had to be machined out. They traded it off for a much smaller channel that gets machined here. Then right under the tail of the extractor, there's a place for a firing pin that's just basically drilled into the slide there. So the slide machining became much simpler. They traded off these two complex parts for one part that is, quite frankly, this is a fairly straightforward to machine part. Much more so than either of the two parts that went away. We have two roll pins that replaced out the sear lever pin here on the part, was replaced out with a 3/32 sear lever pin, and the extractor, instead of being held together by the whole mechanism, is held by an extractor pin, which is a 5/64 roll pin, and then there's a spring under the extractor. These components are not expensive to make, all three of these, and this one part to be machined is far simpler of a machining job than either of the two parts that it replaced. Everything became much more easy at the factory in terms of machining of the slide. So this, I think, shows you the real story behind why this change happened. It wasn't necessarily for performance, although maybe there was a performance upside to it as well. But it was very much economy. One could also argue potentially aesthetics as well. We're going to stay here in the slide. We're going to hit on another part here real quick. That's the high powers firing pin. We do not encounter, just for point of reference, in all high power models, regardless of manufacturer and generation, we have not encountered any widespread issues with the high powers firing pin or it frequently requiring replacement. We have replaced a handful in a year and a half through our service center. But again, this is not a frequent thing. We compare every firing pin through our service center with a brand new part, and if there's certainly any dimensional difference, then we replace it. But this has no real fracture reputation. We recommend that high power owners have one of these in their toolbox. If you have 5 high powers, having one of these in your toolbox is probably appropriate, or say one for every 5 high powers that you have. Again, just not a high frequency of replacement kind of a part. We also want to talk real quickly about, while we're talking about the firing pin, we've talked about the firing pin retaining plate, we've talked about the firing pin, but we want to talk about the spring that backs up that firing pin. When you put the firing pin into the drop safety model, you have to put some pressure down on the drop safety in order to depress the firing pin in, and then in order to install the retaining plate. The firing pin spring that backs up that firing pin in the high power pistol, we just put that firing pin in against the resistance of the spring. That's keeping this firing pin in this part of the pistol away from the primer. The firing pin comes through the breech area in the slide here, and the spring originally, the firing pin spring was also your drop safety. So in other words, if you had a situation where you had a muzzle drop, when you think about it, you got the firing pin up here, the muzzle hits the ground, and this firing pin can keep going and theoretically hit the primer. So Browning and FN, as far as we know, typically used a very beefy kind of a firing pin spring. Tissos, Careen, Arcus, I believe also, no, not FEG, but many used a very, very light firing pin spring. Now, where you have a condition 3 application, where guys are not running around with a round in the chamber all the time and you don't have a drop safety, this firing pin spring is fine. Not optimal, but it's fine. You don't need the drop safety protection so much if you're a condition 3 application. However, if you are one of the older high powers without the drop safety sear lever and you are a condition 1 guy, it is imperative that you have the heavy firing pin spring. BHSpringSolutions heavy firing pin spring is a copy of Browning's firing pin spring, basically. Our light firing pin spring is equivalent to the firing pin spring found in the Arcus, the Careens, the Tissos high powers as well. Now, here's an interesting note about the firing pin spring. In our testing, we have found that the high powers firing pin spring actually loses strength faster than any other spring in the high power. And for years we thought it was the extractor spring, because the extractor spring is this tiny little spring, and when you press on a high powers extractor right here, you want that to be very rigid. You want it to be very hard. When these extractor springs start to go away, depressing the tail of that extractor becomes very, very easy, and it's primarily because it's the one of the smallest extractor springs that has ever been used in a handgun. It's a very small spring that's expected to do a very, very intense job full time, and it will degrade. And in my personal high power, after about 15 years and 10,000 rounds, I started having malfunctions, and it was the extractor spring, and it was just literally spent at that point. That covers our, if you have a Mark III or Mark III's high power with the drop safety sear lever, that's the appropriate application really for the light firing pin spring. You don't need that firing pin spring doing the drop safety job, although the light one still will to a degree, but the drop safety sear lever mechanics or the engineering of that is what keeps your firing pin from going forward in the event of a muzzle drop. So light firing pin, optimal in drop safety models. The heavy firing pin spring is optimal safety protection in the non-drop safety models. We wanted to share a couple of things. We've been through recoil spring guide rods, but we wanted to talk about a couple more. That would be the recoil spring guide rod used in the Arcus 94C and the rare Careen Compact. It is a smaller version of a regular recoil spring guide rod. It's been shortened, smaller spring inside. There are no replacements for these anywhere. The good news is all Arcus 94 series pistols are still within about 25 years old. At this point in 2020, we've not started seeing failures of these parts yet, but one day we will. And they'll stop controlling the slide stop. The good news is, for right now today, those are still being found functional. In the FM Detective, by about 2/10 of an inch shorter barrel than the 4-inch Arcus 94, they went with a full-length guide rod that looks like this. It has a spring inside, but this spring is only about this amount of room. There's no spring in this area. It's a two-piece affair put together here. BHSpringSolutions manufactures this part. We're the only source for replacement parts for the FM Detective guide rods. And FM Detective guide rods have been known to be failing and not have enough pressure on the ball here anymore. That little spring inside is past its useful life in a lot of FM Detectives. But the recoil spring system, because they went under 4 inches, they couldn't any longer effectively use a single spring solution, or they didn't feel like they could. So they went with a coil spring over a coil spring on a full-length guide rod, and it does a nice job in the FM Detective. These replacement springs, expect in the FM Detectives to be replacing your recoil springs more often than in the full-size high powers. probably about twice as often. Same thing on the compact version of the compact recoil springs. Expect to be replacing those about twice as often as well. In the high power pistol, all full-size high powers with standard pressure ammunition, except your Kareen Mark II and Mark III and your Arcus 94 of all generations of those, a 17-pound recoil spring is your OEM, and among BHSpringSolutions recoil springs, it's your best standard pressure ammunition recoil spring for general purpose use. If you have a Kareen Mark II or III or an Arcus 94 high power, you want a 15-pound recoil spring. A 17-pound will cause you to short cycle. It's too much spring, and it's overspringing your pistol. For years, before BHSpringSolutions existed, there was some belief that you would better the performance of a high-power pistol with standard pressure ammunition, and again, I'm talking about FN Browning or Browning high-power look-alike clones. By using an 18.5-pound recoil spring with standard pressure ammunition. Based on the springs from the spring manufacturers at the time, that may have been true. A true 18.5-pound recoil spring that also increases the resistance on the front end, not just the 18.5 pounds of push, is what the springs are, is what that 18.5 pounds mean. It means when the slide is all the way back, when the spring is compressed at that dimension, that's how much weight that spring will push from that going back into battery. A true 18.5 pound recoil spring is going to be in all high powers. Too much spring for standard pressure ammunition. If you're a guy that shoots plus P ammunition, again, in your Browning high powers and high power clones, the 18.5 pound recoil spring is very much the right spring if you do that. The 15-pound recoil spring in Browning high power and look-alike clones, this is an interesting spring because for guys that want a better slide rack or an easier slide rack, you can go to the 15-pound recoil spring as long as you are using a 30 or a 32-pound mainspring. And you'll have extraction distance, generically speaking, 8, 9, possibly approaching 10 feet away from the pistol. This is the upper end of slide velocity that you want to be handling, but it can be done. 15-pound is OEM and standard pressure ammunition for the Kareen Mark II and III and the Arcus 94. Kareen Mark II and III and Arcus 94, your plus P spring is a 17-pound recoil spring. For the back to the FM Detective guys, BHSpringSolutions is the only manufacturer of your recoil springs. We have those, and those come in 2 packs. Again, expect to replace your springs more than in a full-size high power. And then our folks with the Arcus 94 C and Kareen compacts, we have 16.5 pound standard recoil springs and 18-pound kind of plus P recoil springs for you guys. Also, you FM Detective owners with your full-length guide rod, you can run either of these single springs as an alternative to the spring in your guide rod as well. However, expect spring life in this to be a little bit less than your double spring kind of recoil spring solution. And finally, the 40 Smith & Wesson recoil, high power recoil spring. In terms of 16, 17, 18, 19 pound recoil springs, this it's intended to help control that 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. And futuristic things that we're looking at BHSpringSolutions LLC is many of these recoil springs we're looking at bringing to market a progressive or variable rate recoil spring, which is going to maintain the performance of the spring but potentially give a little bit friendlier and easier slide rack. A couple of other things we wanted to touch on, that is polish points back in the slide. This is a type 1 sear lever. It sits down in the slide just like that in that channel. One of the things you can polish is the sides of this sear lever. Now I'm talking Dremel tool, polishing compound, nothing abrasive, but polishing the sides of the sear lever. Same way on the type 2 sear lever. It's all on the sides. and that's going to help that operation of that sear lever be even smoother. You can polish the inside of the pinhole of the sear lever as well. The 3/32 roll pin, you can polish that pin in the middle. Is a very good thing to do. Also on the extractor pin, you can polish it. It's a benefit. The hole in the extractor, same way. It's a good polish point as well. So we've covered a ton of ground here, but this is a lot to do with a lot of the slide components and just kind of what they are, and BH Spring Solutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com.